Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Mentors on Tap. This week we're going to keep talking or continue our discussion on page speed and speeding up your website in an effort to both keep your users and the search engines happy. It became more of an issue as websites got bigger, obviously, and anytime you take too long to load a page, you're going to lose you're going to lose viewers, you're going to lose customers. People have no patience, so faster is always better. Last episode, we talked about the technical side of page speed with images primarily, and a few things like lazy loading and being able to defer loading on images at least until later in the page load process, so people get to see more of your content right away. We'll provide a link to that episode there. And today we're going to go on to more technical code level type things where we can do things behind the scenes to really speed up your website with your source code and your plugins. So one of the first things that's really a big issue is programmers are lazy. It's just the nature of the beast. They will grab a giant library of code when they really only need 3 or 4 lines, because it's a library of code and nobody wants to spend the time to edit it for their specific needs. And this is where issues such as Minify and Compress come in handy with CSS and JavaScript, because these are large, they end up being very large text files in some cases. Being able to minify them, which is basically the process of stripping out all the white space and packing all the code together so that a machine can read it, but people really struggle reading it because there's no white space. And then we can also compress the code using gzip or some other server-side compression tools that will make the files a lot smaller and transfer a whole lot faster. And if you want to get really technical with it, you can spend some time and look at your CSS libraries and strip out all the CSS that's not needed for your website, or that's used repeatedly through different plugins or different elements on your website that use the same code, but each one of them loads it individually. Fortunately, if you're a WordPress user, there are plugins that can help you with this. One of my favorites is Auto Optimize, which has a minify and compress feature that does a very good job for the most part. But like anything else, you want to turn it on, run your speed tests, and verify that it did do what you thought it was going to do. When you're doing that, you're also going to want to make sure you have your caching turned off or refreshed at least, so that you're not still serving the old versions of the CSS to the speed test tools. I actually did that one night. I spent an hour trying to figure out why the plugin wasn't working and realized that I hadn't flushed the cache between turning it on and running the test. So it caused a little extra drama than was really necessary.
Done that before.
Yeah, cache is great, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's, usually your first step is the first thing you can test to cut back on your load times. Then you've also got reducing your server calls. This comes back as a combination of the CSS and the JavaScript, where every time you make a call to the server, you add a little bit of time to your server load. And if you're on a shared server or a slow server, this can really affect your page loads. If you've got, you're loading 27 different CSS files, that makes 27 different handshakes, especially now that everything's on HTTPS, where you're having all these secure handshakes take place, rather than combining all of the CSS into one comprehensive file. And then you've only got one call to the server. So you want to look at combining those types of files. JavaScript, CSS are obvious areas where that can be done.
Yeah, one of the things I'd throw in there, Steve, is that sometimes if you're just calling a different color for a button or a different font for some headline, sometimes it's advantageous to just go ahead and pull that little bit of CSS out and make it inline.
Right.
If it's a relatively minor thing, it can actually speed things up a little bit, because again, if you need, let's say that's the only thing on the page that's going to use that color, or that font it may have to download that entire CSS file in order to get it.
Right.
Whereas you can put it in line and speed things up tremendously. It goes right into your HTML.
Yeah, I know the programmers hate us when we say use inline code, but
sometimes it works better. Yeah,
it works better. And if you're just a hunt and peck, copy and paste kind of programmer, like I've kind of evolved into over the years, sometimes it's just easier to figure out where in a line you just need to drop an important CSS and change that one element versus hunting through some overly eager theme developers 427 different CSS files to figure out exactly how to call that one thing. It's just easier to do that inline. Yeah. I'm a big fan of inline CSS in some cases. Another area of things I like to do for websites is making sure we uninstall any unused modules or plugins, depending on which software we're using. This doesn't really speed up your website very much or at all, because in theory, these deactivated plugins and modules should not be impacting your website. But it's a good housekeeping issue, because I've found users, clients who will go back through and say, well, why isn't this turned on? And why isn't that turned on? And they'll turn on an old copy of TablePress that loads for no good reason, or some other plugin, a video loader, which we no longer need because WordPress loads videos natively now. And all of a sudden they've added a ton of code to their website that's just not necessary anymore and hasn't been cleaned up for whatever reason. And that's, I don't know, what's your personal record for the most active plugins on a website?
113.
Holy crap. Mine's only 87. Yeah.
I had 113. Well, actually, I lied. There was 113 installed. 5 of them were not active.
Oh my God! Like still 108.
108, and got it down to 14.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of them that were redundant. There were several of them that weren't even being used anywhere, or the vast majority of them were things that literally 1 or 2 lines of code replaced the plugin. What they were trying to accomplish. And Marge sold me on this concept a long time ago, that it's so much better when so many of these plugins can be done with a very minor bit of code editing.
Right.
And as long as you're using a child theme, you don't have to worry about losing that on updates.
Mm-hmm.
And again, plugins are one of the favorite vulnerabilities for hackers to get into a site. So getting rid of those plugins is also a security plus.
Yeah. I've never understood the people who use plugins to load Google Analytics or Tag Manager onto their website. It's
really,
it's
so easy on Google.
Why are you letting some plugin manage this? Because, like you say, somebody, the plugin could get compromised. You have no idea, unless you go through and look at the code, how much extra code's being loaded into your website, when all you have to do is paste this tiny little block of JavaScript in the header of your website and be done with it. It's baffling sometimes.
Worth mentioning, too, is the fact that some plugins, not all of them by any means, but some plugins, you can actually activate the plugin, make use of it. And one of them that I have used before is redirection for planning 301s, okay? You can actually put that plugin online, place your redirections, and then deactivate and delete the plugin, and they'll still be there.
Right, because it's writing to a file.
It's just a little bit easier than having to go into your cPanel and do it manually, because they're very quickly added, and they're also, it's nice, you can actually pull that whole list down and keep it in a file somewhere on your hard drive, so you've got it. But it's just, there's no need with all plugins. Now you have to be careful, you have to check it. Some of them will be dynamic, and when you turn the plugin off, whatever you were having it do will disappear.
Right.
So it varies. What I have found is there's a couple of plugin developers out there on WordPress.org that are pretty conscientious about that. They like to build plugins that can be used and then unplugged.
Right.
And I love that.
Yeah, we just needed to do one thing real fast, and it's easier than diving into the code to figure it out. So
yeah, it's just a shortcut. It helps, yeah.
Yeah. One of the other big issues on web speed is render blocking, CSS and JavaScript. And what this is code that, for whatever reason, has to load completely before it lets the browser or the robot, in Google's case, continue to load the page. So you hit a spot where the web page just kind of freezes, where only the header shows, or maybe just the hero image shows, or maybe nothing at all, and then the whole page pops all at once. These render blocking scripts suck, and they are required in some cases. It's just the nature of programming. Certain things have to load before other things can happen. So you want to look at those and maybe load them last on the page if possible, or see if there's an alternative. A lot of plugins, especially some of the credit card processing plugins or modules, will allow you to choose between synchronous and asynchronous. And being able to load something asynchronous so it can load in the background while something else is loading is incredibly helpful. So at any opportunity, you can change something to an async load. That's what you want to use.
Yep.
And I've also gone ahead and on a few websites that provide an external JavaScript on there. They host the JavaScript, and basically all you're doing is calling the file on their server. If it's something that doesn't change very often, I would go ahead and download it and put it on my own server and call it from my server. You do have to do a little extra maintenance when you do that, just in case they do run an update to their script. But I found that a lot of competent developers have alert statuses that they send out, or can send out if you want to sign up for them, for when they do update their script, for you to go ahead and grab the newest version. So that, because they understand if there's something going on, it may not even be your website's fault. Their website may be getting hammered. And so by having that script on your server, you're reducing the number of external domain calls where you're calling to other websites. You can't do this with things like with Google Analytics. I mean, I suppose you could, but that would be a nightmare because they're constantly tweaking that stuff in the back end, and I wouldn't want to mess with that.
Yeah. But, there's an idea that comes to mind, and I have been an enemy of Google Fonts because it's a massive file, it's very slow to load, and it's an external server call. However, I hadn't thought of that. Pulling Google Fonts onto your own server might have a really significant impact to the speed on that.
Yeah.
It might make it worth keeping. I try to stay away from it just because I had a site not too long ago. A new client came to me. They hired me to speed their site up. They were loading in 17 and 18 seconds on the homepage. And just by going async, I cut it almost in half. It knocked it down to about 10 something. And then getting rid of Google Fonts took off another 6 seconds. Okay. Now, a lot of that was due to the fact that they were hosted on GoDaddy, which traditionally has their ankles deep in molasses anyway. But the Google Fonts is a massive file, and it's a third call. It's going to an external server. So I may have to try that and see how that works out, pulling that onto my own server and seeing what kind of impact that has.
I know for a lot of fast site builds, I use Divi. I know you do too, from Elegant. And they have a tendency to call it Google Fonts because they want to get, because it's a builder, they want everybody to have access to all the different fonts that are available. However, once you've built the website, you almost never change that. So then I go in and edit out their Google Fonts call and just call the couple fonts that I actually want.
And WordPress actually has a number of fonts that are so close to what you can get in Google Fonts. Unless you're picking a really esoteric font, you can usually get right on or very close to what you have anyway.
Comic Sans.
Yeah, everybody likes Comic Sans, right?
I mean, come on. That poor font gets such a bad rap.
Yeah, only way to build a header.
Oh my goodness. So beyond that, we've also got a couple server things you can do. Enabling gzip compression on the server is always a good thing. This is one of those areas that, for the most part, most SEOs are not going to even want to get into that. That's when you fire off an email to your hosting company, and say, "Hey, is this turned on? If it's not, could you please turn it on?" And it takes them 2 seconds, and it's done.
With most hosts, it's very easy. It's just a matter of going into your cPanel and you can turn it on.
What surprises me is how many of them don't run it automatically. I would think in this day and age that would be just an automatic rubber stamp thing. And I kind of understand it, because basically you're trading CPU cycles for bandwidth. And in a lot of hosts, CPU cycles cost more for them than bandwidth does. So they're fine with things running a little slower over the internet versus a little slower on the server, especially if you're on shared equipment.
I've come across a couple of EIG hosting companies that don't allow gzip.
And those would be ones to move away
from.
from.
For that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, EIG is a little, they hear a different drummer anyway.
Yeah.
They're all about their bottom line and the heck with your performance.
Yeah. So another thing you want to do, as long as we're talking about compression, is you want to cache your website as much as possible. A WordPress, this is pretty straightforward. There are half a dozen caching plugins out there, from WP3 Total Cache to WordPress Super Cache, and quite a few others. But you need to be real careful when you enable these, because not all of them play well with all server configurations. It's very easy to enable a caching plugin and have your website just lose its mind. So you want to test thoroughly all aspects of your website once you enable caching, and make sure that it does what it's supposed to be doing.
I've also had a few instances where I update a plugin, some other plugin, and all of a sudden I get a no-load, a white screen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it conflicted with my caching program. Yeah. So anytime you update anything, obviously we always recommend you use a child theme so that you're not going to lose any customizations on updates. But anytime you update a theme, a plugin, or the core, start off with a fresh backup.
Yep.
And then double check. Don't just assume that the site's okay now because you updated something. Double check that the site's still available, because sometimes it won't be. And at that point, now you have to go turn off those plugins or themes and find the problem, isolate it, and back out of it.
I got a call from a friend of mine who's went into the back end and updated a bunch of plugins. And then I get a call, and he says, "Well, my website's not working." And he's right. It's just a plain white screen. And I went ahead and disabled all the plugins and turned stuff back on until I got it working again. And then I started looking at some of the log files, and he had done the update 3 days prior. So it took him 3 days to realize his website was not working at all, because he just hit update and closed out and was done. He never actually went to the website to see if it even loaded.
Never assume.
There's a lot of that. That's why we charge for doing backups. We do, database backups happen daily. Full site backups happen weekly. They get stored off site. Updates to all the plugins happen. Everything gets thoroughly tested, and off we go. It never seems to take very long, maybe 5 or 10, 15 minutes at the most a week. But every once in a while, something will update, and you're going to spend the next 3 hours fixing things. So
my backup favorite is Backup Buddy.
Yeah.
You can set that up automatically or whatever periodicity you like. They give you some cloud storage. You can have it set it to Dropbox. You can have it email it to you. You can have it save it on your server.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to do it. And it's a great program, but you still when you get those notifications, you get an email notification that it has pulled a backup. that's the time to go check your site. So you don't end up with one of these 3 days with your e-com site down.
Yeah, Backup Buddy's actually how I found out one of our clients was using high-res images on their blog
Oh,
post.
you got a 500 gigabyte backup file?
The backup went from 56 gig or 56 meg to, what was it, 240 or something like that in the span of 2 weeks. It's like, uh-oh, what's going on here? And sure enough, they were uploading 8,000 by 8,300 DPI images as
scaling it down to a thumbnail.
Yeah, and scaling them down to a thumbnail, and it was ridiculous. But live and learn. So, and then the last thing we want to talk about, and this is something that not everybody needs to do, but you should consider if your website actually makes money. If you've got a website you're doing for fun or as a hobby, you don't want to get into more pay services than you have to, but it's using a content delivery network or a CDN. And what this does is it takes the static portions of your website and throws them off on somebody else's super whammy server, super close to the main trunk of the internet, so that when all those calls happen, they happen almost instantly, rather than tunneling all the way to wherever your website happens to be hosted. The CDNs are awesome. Some of the bigger ones have built-in denial of service attack protection, hacker protection. There's a lot of good reasons to run a CDN. PageSpeed just happens to be one of them.
Yeah, not for everybody, like you say, but particularly if you have an art site and you're offering high-res images,
right,
you're going to benefit tremendously in terms of speed.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a niche that is particularly prone to be a victim of hacking attempts,
Mm-hmm.
again, the security aspects of a CDN are fantastic. But I don't.
If you're going to be on the Oprah show and Oprah's going to be talking about your product, you want to be on a CDN.
There you go.
And you need to call them and let them know it's coming, because I have seen more people with great opportunities on television, whether it's the Oprah show or Dr. Oz or whatever, not let their hosting company know it's coming, because it requires a whole different level to serve 100,000 people in 10 minutes than it does 100,000 people in a year. It's different databases, configurations, server configurations, all of that has to be managed. And if you don't let them know it's coming, it will ruin your day, because all that great free publicity will be wasted.
Well, plus the fact there are some hosts out there that will still, when they detect that big of a flux, they'll just assume, because it's automated, they'll just assume that there's some sort of a DDoS or hacking attempt, and throttle you down. And even though, because they're not going to let their servers get overburdened, so they just assume that you've got a problem and they'll shut you down.
And I have a story of a friend of ours in the industry. One of his clients got on some national exposure, and his hosting company automatically upgraded your server capacities to handle whatever load you threw at it. Well, they did that happily, and then sent him a very large bill because he didn't pre-plan it with them. So all their automated emergency stuff kicked in, and he got a very large bill that month. His hosting bill went from a couple $100 a month to almost 10 grand.
Wow.
And it was definitely not a good day for him, because he went from thinking he made a lot of money to not quite as much as he thought he made. So,
I would think that most good hosts, if you give them some heads up, they're not going to force you into an upgrade either. They're just going to say, okay, well, this is probably going to be a day or three, and
they'll handle the spike and move on.
Yeah.
So that's always a good thing. Obviously, speeding up your website is a huge topic, and you could get lost in it for months, going for every last little morsel. I'm a firm believer in return on investment for time spent, because there's never enough time to do all the work that needs to be done. So I tend to target, most people when they do run their speed test, like on Pingdom, it gives you a score, a 1 to 100 score. And I'm actually really happy at like 88 and above, somewhere kind of where, if I have time, I might come back and try to grab a couple of extra points or something. But there are people out there that hold that 100 as a badge of honor. But you could spend months chasing that, trying to squeak out every little tweak. So, if you run your speed test and it says, your website's performing better than 90% of the websites on the internet, that's usually more than enough, both for the search engines and your users. If it says your website's performing better than 16% of the websites on the internet, you probably want to spend a little bit of time getting that up. And so you could definitely, everybody needs to do it. It's especially now that mobile is so huge, the faster your website is. And then of course that opens up the whole issue of AMP. Do we really want to get into AMP, accelerated mobile pages and all that other fun stuff from our friends at Google? I personally hate AMP. I think it's hideous. It's ugly. If I wanted to serve ugly web pages, I would just serve static HTML myself. But I don't want to serve ugly web pages. I want to serve web pages that have some design element to them. So I don't run AMP. And I have only got one client who it might be marginally useful for. If you want to be up in the carousel at the top of the Google search, it might be worth doing. But otherwise, I can't bring myself to push that kind of stuff onto a client.
No, I agree. I cannot see AMP being advantageous for any of my clients or for any of my sites. I see it being advantageous, like you say, for a limited scope. If you want to get in that carousel, certainly that's a great opportunity to possibly get there. But no, I'm not a fan of it. One of the other points that I think is worth making, for folks that have been doing this for 10, 15 years, there was a time not that long ago when there were things that you could do, one thing that you could do on your site that would have a tremendous impact on its performance.
Right.
In terms of page speed, there's a number of things that can have some fairly heavy impact, like images. If you're loading up 8,000 by 8,000 images and scaling it down to a thumbnail, obviously you could do that properly and have a tremendous impact on your page load. But the vast majority of things in SEO or site development these days are no longer, you get a lot of bang for your buck out of this one element. Now it's a matter of having to go after 10 or 12 or 20 elements to really get that same bang for your buck.
You got to fiddle all the knobs at the same time.
And the longer you do it, and the better you get at it, and the closer you get to perfection, the less impact you're going to see from each individual element. So it's a constant. It's like SEO is not a task; it's a process. It's a journey. You're going to continuously be tweaking it, and it's the same thing with tweaking your site technically. Nobody, well, I should say nobody. Very, very rare are you going to see a site that's 100% all the way across the board.
Yeah.
But like Steve is saying, if you're 96, 99% across the board, that's pretty damn good.
Yeah. I'm sure there's something else you could be doing that give you a little bit better bang for the buck.
Exactly. Look for some ROI. Put your time, especially if you're in this as a business, if you're doing SEO, or even if you're just running your own e-com site and doing that as a business. There are things you could be doing that'll be making you money rather than taking your time away from things.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I think that covers it for this week.
Sorry.
I was just saying, I think that covers us for this week. We're going to try to be a little more consistent. It's sometimes hard for Doc and I to get our schedules to synchronize, but we're going to work on that. And obviously, if you guys have any questions, find us on Facebook or LinkedIn or even on our website. Drop us an email or a tweet or whatever your favorite carrier pigeon of the day is. And we'll see what we can do to help out.
Thanks for joining us, folks.
Have a good week, everybody.